of IT innovation in the environments in which you're operating. And let me start with Brad.
Thank you. So I think probably it's important to separate two different kinds of IT innovation. I think that the basic infrastructure that we all now depend on, things like chips and routers and the basic hard science problems of creating the IT infrastructure is a very different kind of innovation than creating the next Foursquare or Twitter or Tumblr, the applications layer services that ride now on top of the internet. I think you have two different problems. I think with the infrastructure investing or infrastructure innovation, the educational environment, I think it's not at all a surprise that you've seen the centers of innovation in that sector of IT developing around universities. I think that's a critical component of that. But in the other sector, where you're investing in the applications layer, you're really designing systems that humans use to interact with each other, and that immediately and directly have an impact on society. So Uber is not apolitical. It's immediately involved in taxing, transportation policy and things like that. And so in that second sector, the more important thing is an open regulatory framework that allows for that kind of innovation to happen. So I think you start with education, and as you move to the applications layer, you focus more on the regulatory framework.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I invite each of our panel to comment on this.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much to Columbia University and CIGI and SIPA for the kind invitation. So in terms of drivers, I would like to introduce what I consider and we consider as also the Internet Society to be one of the main drivers of innovation. This is the concept of permissionless innovation. And we all know that in almost all modern technology debates, the discussion revolves around the permission question, which essentially asks, must the creators of new technologies seek the blessing of public officials before they develop their innovations? So, and depending on how one answers this question, one also can tell how one approaches new technologies, including, of course, the internet. And generally speaking, there are two general dispositions. So on the one hand, we have the precautionary principle, which refers to the idea that new innovations should be curtailed or disallowed until their developers can prove that their innovations do not have a negative impact on laws, norms, culture, etc. And then, of course, you have the permissionless innovation idea, which is that innovators are able to experiment with new technologies and new business models, and any effects that those business models do create, regulators and policy makers will deal with them later. So, in the context of the internet, the idea of and the notion of permissionless innovation has been a key driver in reaching where we are right now. Imagine an environment where Google, Facebook, and all these other businesses would have to go and ask for permission before they created something. So to the extent that the technology and the technologies around the internet evolve and progress and grow, permissionless innovation constitutes this very key principle and driver that allows people in their garages or anywhere else to create and innovate using the internet.
Mm-hmm. So I think I'm hearing a point of commonality between both of your remarks. When you speak about the policy environment, you're speaking a policy environment that isn't inhibiting an Uber to come, Brad, if I'm understanding you, and you too are speaking about an environment that isn't constrained by other factors. Now let me invite you to speak to Brazil and what you see as the conditions and drivers.
Sure. Thank you, Dean. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I think Brazil tells a slightly different story here. Brazil is an excellent test case to what happens with the internet without any regulation. because commercial internet in Brazil was available in 1995, and until last year, April 2014, Brazil basically had no laws saying anything about the regulation of the internet. So if you read John Perry Barlow and that scholarship from the 90s, that would say, well, the state should be away from the internet, that's the best thing governments could do. And you look what happened in Brazil was exactly the opposite. This absence of rules basically put a lot of pressure on the judiciary, and it created a huge amount of legal uncertainty. So basically, if you were an entrepreneur in Brazil by the middle of the 2000s, and you wanted to know what are the rules about intermediary liability, what are the rules for interconnectivity, net neutrality, free speech, what are the powers of the government to actually take down content or not, these rules had not been decided. And as a result of that, the courts started making completely contradictory decisions. So one judge would say something about intermediary liability, and then a judge sitting next room would say exactly the opposite. So for entrepreneurs, that was entrepreneurship hell. It was a very difficult scenario, and that's actually what happened with this allegedly freedom or absence on the part of the government. So at some point in the 2000s, Brazil decided to act. And unfortunately, the initial response to this environment was a very bad one. Brazil wanted to create a criminal law in order to regulate the internet, one that was really draconian. Something similar to SOPA and PIPA, but actually 4 or 5 years before that happened in the US. So just to give you an example, if you unlocked your phone, had that law been passed, you would go to jail for 4 years. And believe me, you don't want to spend 4 years in a Brazilian jail. It's a really bad idea. Same thing would happen if you transferred MP3s from your iPod back into your computer, 4 years in jail. That law almost passed. And when the Brazilian society realized that was about to happen, there was a huge mobilization online. At the time, there was no Facebook. Facebook was still something on the verge of being created. But there was a website called Petition Online that was very poorly designed, but that was good enough at the time. And 150,000 people signed to that website to stop that bill. And soon, myself and a group of other researchers, we made a proposal to the government, which was, instead of having a criminal law, why not creating a Bill of Rights? A Bill of Rights that solves the intermediary liability issue, privacy issues, net neutrality, and so on. And that idea escalated very fast. So it's interesting to see that that was 2009, and Brazil was already discussing net neutrality at that moment, something that the US ended up discussing more recently, I would say. So that became a sort of a household idea that people would open the Sunday newspapers and read about net neutrality in 2009 already. Well, to make a long story short, after almost 7 years of intensive battles and articulations and political disputes with multiple stakeholders, and with a little support from these Snowden revelations, Brazil ended up passing the law in April 2014. And it's important to mention these Snowden revelations because the law would have passed by any means, but that has actually made it pass earlier than it could have passed. And it's interesting because when the Snowden case happened, it hit especially strongly in Brazil. The Brazilian president was very upset with the whole case. I have to say that she is usually upset all the time, but she was especially upset because she had been personally surveilled in her email account. So she decided to act. And interestingly, the action that she decided to do was to put pressure over Congress to pass this Bill of Rights. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very significant because instead of upping the same game and promoting surveillance or engaging in an arms race, mm-hmm. the response of Brazil was actually to go to the other direction and say, let's have a civil rights regulated internet, which is good for innovation, it's good for entrepreneurs, it's good for the citizen, you have privacy, you have net neutrality, and you have free speech upheld. So that was the response of Brazil. And I think that tells a lot about the relationship between the law and the environment for innovation.
And let me just say, ask you one question about that. I mean, what does success look like now? I mean, how do you know that it's working? If you say the absence of rules was creating uncertainty because of contradictory regulatory responses, I mean, how do you feel? How do you get a sense that it's working to support entrepreneurship and innovation?
That is a very good question. And actually, a journalist from the Financial Times just called like 1 week ago to ask the same question. And actually, success is very tangible now, Dean Merritt, because the courts have started like making the right decisions based on the law, because there used not to be a standard. So precedents have changed. Just to give you an example, there was a Twitter case 2 weeks ago decided under the new law. And for instance, the Brazilian police had this bad habit of asking service providers to handle data directly, and the service providers had to fight that on the courts, and often they would lose because there was no law. So some judges would say, of course, the police is asking for your data, you should handle your data to the police. And then something happened again. Police authority asked from Twitter part of their data. And the new judge, just said, no, we have a law now and you cannot do that. In order to get data, you have to go to a court. There's a threshold and you have to meet those thresholds in order to obtain data. So in short, net neutrality has been upheld. There were a lot of issues like with throttling and like service discriminations in Brazil. All those have stopped. And the courts are now applying these standards that have been built into the law. So 1 year after the approval, I can say that success looks working well. It doesn't mean that there is still not work to be done, especially now in terms of the implementation. But the landscape now is much better than it was 1.5 years ago.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, let me invite Sharad Sanghi, who has built a very successful technology company in India, to give your perspective on the critical drivers. India has a reputation for an entrepreneurial culture.
Yes. So I just, first of all, Devi, thank you for inviting me, and it's a privilege to be amongst all you learned people here. I'll just give a quick background in terms of statistics of where India is in terms of internet users. It's third in the world with 250 million, and in a couple of years will probably be second after China. It's 960 million cell phone users. That's second only to China, which is at 1.2 billion. And in terms of, and I'll connect these statistics to what I'm going to say in a minute. 142nd most difficult country to do business in, and weak cybersecurity, data privacy, and data protection laws. Economy is still growing at over 7%. Okay, so that's roughly the background that is there. So the mobile penetration and the cost of the device coming down to under 50, a smartphone coming within $50 has, and the huge access, 960 million users on the mobile has created a huge domestic market. And not to mention the borderless internet gives you a huge global market. Hopefully there's no fragmentation, as we heard earlier. The software talent and the entrepreneurial mindset of Indians at large not only provides talent pool for people to do software and to do write various innovative applications, but also a lot of the outsourcing of global majors like Cisco, EMC, all the major US companies have their backends in India. A lot of the product managers and the innovators in these companies have suddenly started realizing, why am I doing this for somebody else? Why not do it for myself, right? And that along with venture capital with a huge amount of venture capital entering India. I think that was resultant of the fact that there were successful models in the US, like Amazon and others. There were Facebook, Twitter, and others. There were then successful models in China, and just the size of the Chinese market caused a lot of venture capital to flow there. The next obvious destination was India, and so that's, a lot of venture capital is also flowing in India. So a combination of all these factors, the entrepreneurial mindset, the talent pool, the access to venture capital, the huge domestic market, has spurred a lot of innovation in India. And you have several companies over the last couple of years that are part of the unicorn club, which is, suddenly these companies have come up from nowhere and have become, their valuations are multi-billion dollars in a very short time. But it's not enough for that. It has impacted all sections of society. I mean, it has helped in, and one more thing, the infrastructure is now very cheap. With cloud computing, for example, right? Any developer can set up relatively cheaply an application on the internet, which potentially can not only target the domestic market but also the global market, right? So a lot of innovative applications. There is, somebody spoke earlier about open source drug discovery. There are a lot of other applications where there's a company that's created using data analytics to come up with customized cancer cure, and a lot of other very interesting applications that are there. Poor people are also benefiting not only from an education perspective, where there's education over the internet, but also handicrafts in villages are getting markets within India because of the e-commerce and internet revolution. Some of the challenges, very quickly, that we have are ambiguous laws. So it's kind of there are not enough laws, but which in some sense is good, because if there is too much regulation, that might stifle innovation. And generally the Indian government stance recently has been in favor of net neutrality, and so that's also hopefully not going to stifle innovation. But ambiguity in laws, so I agree with both of them in some sense. The ambiguous nature in laws would also result in conflicting judgments and uncertain environment. And so hopefully we've seen that happening in 2005 when the CEO of eBay India was arrested for nothing wrong, right? It was basically a platform, and some pornographic CD got sold on it, and eBay India CEO went to jail. But that has changed since then. So in 2005 there was an ambiguous law. In 2011 that was fixed, and intermediaries were, there was a framework, rules put in for intermediaries to overcome that. But overall, I think my opinion is that if the government doesn't get involved on IT, in the IT sector, and allows, just takes care of no retrospective taxation so that foreign investors can come in, and doesn't have any onerous regulations that are difficult to fulfill, I believe this trend of innovation will continue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Brad, there's been a lot of discussion today about data localization and how jurisdictions are more and more considering such measures, and some discussion about how big a problem is this. Have you some thoughts around this area?
I do. I wonder if I can ask your indulgence and try and pull the last conversation together a
yes,
bit before
absolutely.
I jump into that one.
You bet.
Because I think there's a way to reconcile the idea of permissionless innovation with the idea of a set of laws that fosters innovation. And I think the key distinction is that the laws that foster innovation aren't prescriptive in trying to achieve an outcome. They create an environment that allow for innovation to happen. They create a set of rules that are designed to clarify uncertainty, but not to define outcomes. And so a Bill of Rights as opposed to a set of rules that constrain innovation. And I think the challenge we have in the United States is that the evolution of the rulemaking is really driven by the relationship between incumbents in markets and politicians. And it has a lot to do with the way we finance campaigns and the fact that incumbents have longstanding relationships. And often the proposals coming out of the politicians are innocent and naive. They've only heard from one person and one group of people, because it's the people that they interact with. And the good news is that the internet has also shown a way, and I think it can happen in Brazil, and obviously happened given your petition drive, that it can sort of protect its own openness, because you saw it with People Soap in the United States, you just recently saw it with the net neutrality debate, you saw people organizing on the internet to create a counterweight to the sort of insider relationship that the incumbents have. So I think the goal is to protect permissionless innovation, but it isn't a completely libertarian view to say, we can't have any role for government, but the role for the government should be to create markets that work and to create rules that are clear but not constraining, and I think we can have both.
Well, thank you for pulling this together. I think this is really very, very important. I must say, when I go to Silicon Valley, I find, that there is an antipathy to policy, a sense that, it is mostly troublesome, and, that there isn't that kind of protective environment created by policy. And I just wonder if you could say more about what you think are these conditions, the policy environment that's supportive, and even with respect to, say, New York City, which is very keen on becoming more of a tech, hospitable to tech. What do you see as some of those ingredients that are supportive of innovation and create a safe space?
So it's easier to answer that in the other way, in the sense of, because we now have a proposal in the city of New York coming from the Taxi and Limousine Commission that would require every ride-sharing startup to submit their software updates to the Taxi and Limousine Commission for review before they release them. And that is the kind of thing that would just bring innovation to a grinding halt. And it was kind of innocent on their part. They didn't really. They do not understand fast cycle times or the way people create software these days, and so they didn't think it was a big deal. Why not? I mean, maybe it's going to change the relationship with the customer and the driver, and so therefore we should be in the middle of that. So it's so to try and answer the question another way, and maybe bring it back to data localization. Markets work as a result of a long history of law and norms around the idea of property. And in the physical world, or as the internet people say, in meat space, it's pretty well defined. It's had a long history and as you move into intellectual property with copyright and patents, it gets a little looser and confusing, and it's a real battleground right now. Move beyond that to what property rights in data mean. We haven't even begun to think about it. But if you wanted to create a framework that would allow for innovation and yet begin to define rights and defining rights in data, defining the rights that an individual has in their data, would go a long way. I'll give you one very concrete example. There was a breach a year ago of Target's credit card records. 80 million credit card records were lost to the internet, or someone out there. And Target just settled that with the government for a $10 million fine, essentially. And that's a complete misunderstanding of what the real liability for that is. I mean, I think that 80 million people times the anxiety of not knowing whether or not your credit card records have been lost is a lot more than $10 million. And so if we if we were able to establish what an individual's interest in their data was, and then assign the liability associated correctly, we would begin to see a market emerge that would allow for innovation and get that balance right. And then the interesting question is that going to emerge in different ways in different parts of the world? Right now, the data localization arguments are actually not helping create healthy environments. What they're actually doing is oftentimes entrenching existing competitors, most of which are the direct target of these rules, particularly in Europe, to try and overturn the dominance of these competitors. But by creating a whole set of restrictions, they're actually making it possible only for the more established players that have the revenue and the income to support that, managing that kind of process. And the startups just can't deal with having, if Foursquare, which exists in, several hundred, more than 100 countries, had to figure out how to manage that, it could never do that. But Google could do that, and Facebook could do that.
Yes, please.
Can I comment really quick? I think you're completely right in the point that this conversation is actually converging. One of the most important things about the Brazilian law is that it curbed the government from exercising power over the internet. So only the courts can do that. And it's interesting because if you see other democracies like Russia or Turkey, they have passed laws doing exactly the opposite. So basically they passed laws in which the government itself can take down content, can regulate how bloggers post or not, and that sort of thing. And mostly, I think one of the most important achievements of that law in Brazil was actually to get the government to be forbeared in order to exercise any sort of control over the internet. And the second thing that I think is really important that you also mentioned is actually listening to the more diverse types of voices when you're dealing with a legislation like that. So that's exactly what made this particular law in Brazil possible, was the creation of an online platform in which anyone could have a say. This online platform was created in partnership with the Ministry of Justice in Brazil. That had this amazing effect that all the stakeholders had to put their cards on the table. So you have the telcos providing their comments side by side with librarians, with individual users, with the banks, and everyone else. Only that transparency was very valuable per se. And I think if it was not for that platform and that strategy, this law would never have been passed. And the last comment is about also on this point, what is happening to Uber in Brazil right now. So basically, Uber has been in a sort of a legal roller coaster in Brazil. One day you wake up and it's prohibited by the courts, and then the other day it's allowed by the courts. And it's interesting because in all the discussions surrounding Uber that involves the taxi driver union, it involves the city government, it involves the courts, no one actually asked the users, the citizens, what they think about Uber, whether they would like to have the Uber service running or not. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because I believe that sort of consultation process can actually speak to that as well.
Constantine?
Thank you. So a couple of points from the discussion that is happening right now. So first of all, there is this misconception that when we talk about permissionless innovation, the regulation has no place, which is really not the case. The idea of permissionless innovation stands on the premise that let's not regulate before we see the invention that is out. So permissionless innovation is not associated and has nothing to do with anarchy, as a lot of people argue. It's actually the contrary. It has to do a lot with the freedom to actually innovate and create. And going back to what Brad was saying about and data localization, and why actually we go and regulate, why the government has to regulate. This is what governments do. This is why we elect governments, because we want them to protect us as citizens. And especially in the context of data localization, all these reactions are coming because of privacy and security concerns, and especially what is happening lately. And all those are very, very legitimate concerns. So the question is not whether, so the question is not whether we should regulate, and it is not really, and we should not really ignore all these problems that are created by the internet as a disruptive technology. But the question is how we can address those problems. And going back to what you said, I think that Brazil, through Marco Civil, demonstrated that one of the ways to do that, amongst many other ways, is through a bottom-up and inclusive process. You talked about the platform that was established whereby everybody was able to contribute.
Yeah.
We saw something similar happening in Iceland, where the constitution literally changed through Facebook. The government was asking people to contribute to the principles that they would like to see ingrained within their constitution. It can happen through other means like voluntary self-regulation and the sharing of best practices that we also see more and more happening in the context of copyright. I mean, suddenly we had SOPA and PIPA, and then we had this copyright alert system, which we can say a lot about it, but at the end of the day, it is a collaborative approach between industry, between ISPs. There is also there are also public interest groups there that do participate, trying to create a framework. So regulation is not to be judged after the innovation comes, but it's only to be judged before the innovation comes. And that is where there is this very fine balance that we always need to bear in mind, so we do not prohibit innovators from creating, but at the same time we take into account the problems that are being created through these innovations.
Okay, thank you. Let me say, in Sharad's case, you're the dominant player, but I understand that you've actually been, quite opposed to data localization. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, data localization actually would technically benefit a company like ours because we get more business if people are forced to host in India. but that's a short-term view, right?
Yeah.
There are many reasons why. As Brad mentioned, it would make the entrepreneurs having to pay a lot more if they have to not only host infrastructure all over the world, but also manage it all over the world. So it's unnecessary. And not only that, so it imposes a lot more complexity and cost, and it would then stifle innovation. It would maybe prevent companies from coming into India who would have otherwise done business here, right? They may end up saying, okay, we'll let this be, and we will, if they had to choose, it will reflect the thinking of the government, where it is, where they think that the view is very narrow, and they would rather go with a more liberal, open place. And we've had cases where companies that needed to establish an Asian hub, right, ended up choosing Singapore over India because of regulations that were prohibitive. And so I think in the long term, I'm not in favor of data localization. And also for when you have a global cloud, we are now part of Entity Communications, and Entity has a global seamless cloud, and we don't want to increase complexity to see where the data is hosted. It should be anywhere in the world. It shouldn't matter.
I'm going to ask one last question and then open it up, so I invite our guests to be thinking of questions. But I'd like you to just start us off with a return sweep of engagement on really the extent to which you think there is a diffusion, if you will, of innovation. Let's take Brad's second category, if you will, but also consider the first as a result of information technology. In developing countries, we have several examples here. It's often said that you're able to use the internet for financial inclusion, you're able to have educational extension, that there is an economic growth, there's small and medium-sized enterprise impact as a result of information technology, and the ability to extend, in effect, innovation within developing countries as well as developed countries. It's really transformative and a source, one could say, both for growth and perhaps optimism about the future. Is that a vision that's shared by this distinguished and experienced group, or not? I'm going to start
So
with.
I agree with that, and so I do believe that the internet, as long as there's a framework, as you mentioned, and as long as there's no restrictive regulation, there is a lot of innovation that is happening that is making the success based on merit as opposed to success based on the big companies getting licenses and becoming bigger and preventing smaller companies from entering. So whether it's in the area of healthcare, in the area of education, as you mentioned, all across there is innovation happening, and in a permissionless way, I would say, and in a manner where even before the government realizes that there is that there is something that has happened, it's become so big and so useful to the people at large that it just pervades. So I agree with what you said here.
Mm-hmm. What's your perspective?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's interesting, for instance, to see technology as part of infrastructure. And I think the countries who have understood that earlier have positioned themselves like in order to foster innovation in a more constructive way. Mm-hmm. The other point is, I was listening to Carolina Rossini speak in the panel before this one, and she was mentioning how internet regulation is being embedded in trade agreements. And if you think about the case for intellectual property, that's exactly what happened. So you had the TRIPS agreement, which was actually negotiated as part of the WTO, and it created a lot of imbalances in terms of how intellectual property is actually a tool that should promote innovation, but often, especially in the developing world, it does not fulfill that promise. And one of the reasons for that was precisely because those set of rules, they were actually negotiated as part of a trade agreement rather than any sort of other instrument that would have had a more comprehensive participation on that. So this is something that I worry about. I think many of the decisions that are often made about internet regulation, they take place more and more in the trade setting, and I think this is something that we should be careful about. So I really believe in a more mission-oriented, collaborative, participatory process, rather than handing these decisions to closed commissions, experts, who often don't even have a clue of the environment and the requisites for innovation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So, very briefly, the internet is this extraordinary thing, not by accident. At some point, some people like Vint Cerf that was talking this morning made a very conscious choice that we're going to build this network and we're going to build it based on some very specific principles that the technical community will operate under, and those principles relate also to open standards, to the idea of the internet is based on open standards. And if you see the way the Internet Engineering Task Force and other technical organizations are actually conducting their work and they're coming up with these standards, it's quite remarkable, and it is remarkable for innovation. They are transparent, they're based on transparency, they're based on voluntary adoption, the idea that we're not imposing this on anyone. They're based on, we let the market decide which ones to take. And these are attributes that slowly have even moved and spinned over into the policy work. We're talking all the time about the need for transparency and accountability. These are principles that have been accompanying the internet, the technical aspects of the internet since day one, and the people doing and creating those standards still continue to abide with these. So in terms of how the internet is changing innovation, I think that we are experiencing this innovation revolution, if you want, because of those very principles that have been embedded and the way the technical community, first and foremost, wants to make sure that these principles continue to exist and allow the internet to grow and continue to evolve.
Okay, thank you. Brad?
So globalization of innovation, the globalization of opportunity has been such an incredibly wonderful thing to watch unfold. And it's not just that the internet has made it possible for people at far-flung locations around the globe to participate in the economy. They've actually, in many cases, because of the local context, come up with completely different solutions that we would never have imagined. So M-Pesa in Kenya, as an example, in-game purchases came out of Korea. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time as investors looking at right now is the kind of the devolution of social networks and into their component parts and what's now happening with messaging, a lot of which has been innovated in China. And so we are learning from things that would not have happened if things happened in a single cultural context. And that's great. I'm going to throw out one other idea to come back to regulation for a second, and that is we've heard two examples of challenges around something called intermediary liability that happened in Brazil and happened in India. And in the U.S., one of the great things that happened, and mostly by accident, was something called Section 230, which protected intermediaries from liability for what their users did. If we want, and I believe we do, we want the model of regulation that you were describing that is adaptive and reactive as opposed to prescriptive and rather than regulating entry, allow innovation to happen and manage the results. And we have this enormous opportunity to do that because these systems that are based on the internet produce an unbelievable amount of data. You know, with Uber, as an example, you know who the passenger was, who the driver was, where the pickup was, where the drop-off was, how the passenger rated the driver, how the driver rated the passenger, how fast the driver was moving, you know, what happened with the accelerometer, whether they brake heavily and stuff like that. So this data exists, right? Now, if you're regulating the transportation industry, you've never seen anything like that before. The problem is that the regulators, who are essentially working in an old model and fairly closely tied and captured by the incumbent industry, they want to use that data to shut down the new idea because it's a threat to the taxi industry, essentially. So we need a intermediary liability protection, some kind of Section 230, so a new player can say, okay, I will share my data with you. And there's all sorts of issues around protecting personal privacy and stuff like that. I have to anonymize the data, but I can share anonymized data with you, and then you can manage this marketplace from a vantage point of a hugely greater amount of information. But you can't use that data to put me out of business because the laws reflect an older world, and the data would reveal that I am disobeying the laws. And so it's a really tricky set of problems, but I'll come back to how important it is to understand how to use this data to solve some of these problems.
And you've mentioned anonymizing the data as one element that might be very helpful in a number of ways. Are there others that you're thinking?
Well, I mentioned earlier beginning to wrestle with the questions of whose data it is and how rights and responsibilities associated with that data are assigned. Very important set of questions. The anonymization, by the way, is really hard, and anybody who's stared at that problem knows it's possible to re-identify people based on patterns much more easily than many people think. Yes. So not only do you have to anonymize it, but then you probably have to have a little some kind of legal framework that says if you consciously re-identify, you're taking some kind of extraordinary liability risk to do that, because otherwise people will do that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I think we should open it up for, please, and could you identify yourself?
Is the microphone on? Yeah, the mic should be on. Is it just for experts and lawyers? So my question actually falls right on Brad's point about big data, because the one point that wasn't brought up as one of the drivers of innovation in the internet space was the business model. That you have this business model where it is essentially, I'll provide you a free service, you give us the data, we sell the data, we go from there. So that sort of links to the conversation downstairs, it links to the conversation that happened in this room earlier about human rights. So I was just hoping to maybe get all the panelists' viewpoint on how much of the innovation we see online is actually driven by that business model rather than permissionless innovation and all the rest. So just get a sense of that. Thank you.
Would like to
All right.
that.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because after the micro-civil legislation, the legislation that is right now being crafted is the data protection law. So this is a point in which I believe everyone agrees that has been an important drive, both for innovation and for economic factors everywhere. But here you have to reach a balance. I think the balance here is protecting the environment for big data, for disseminating the possibilities which are
one of Colombia's mushroom assets.
Should be protected. Some bug on the wires, but anyway. And also, but also you have to balance individual rights here, because a lot of things that have been discussed in this conference
broad question actually
at play when you raise so the issue of trust, the issue of citizens feeling uncomfortable with the amount of monitoring, and also the impact of big data over human rights. So in a developing country like India or Brazil, if your credit score is wrong, that can simply ruin your life. So you have to have a right for rectification of wrong information. You have to have some transparency about the data that is being collected from you. So the point here is I'm not with the sides that basically say that we should stop with data analysis or anything like that. I believe the challenge here is indeed how to reach a balance between rights and economic promotion and innovation.
So, very briefly, in Europe we have started, so first of all, yes, innovation is really, everything is about it. And I think that this is very obvious to everyone. In Europe we have started actually discussing, and policymakers have started approaching and selling the idea of privacy as an economic right, and what it means within the context of this data collection and the various data issues that we see happening in terms of innovation. But and here's where regulation could become very beneficial, for example, because misuse of that data will automatically have to trigger some sort of regulation in order to make sure that the data of citizens is protected, the privacy of these people are protected, and the services that abuse that data do not continue to abuse them. So I think that a lot of innovation is driven by data, but this is where we see is a clear example of where regulation can have actually a very positive impact in order to make sure that it prevents any abuse of that data when it occurs.
Okay, I think we have another question there.
Sure, thanks.
Please identify yourself. No anonymized questions.
Hi, I'm Peter Mysek. I work for Access. We're a digital rights NGO. Thanks to the panel. I guess I want to push back a little bit on the idea that all innovation is about data, or at least the implication that data maximization and collection are the keys to successful business models. We've seen, at least in New York, some innovators like DuckDuckGo that create search engines that don't collect data on individual users. Of course, there's plenty of data flowing through those search queries, but I guess the point I'm getting to is what are the leverage points to influence those business models, and how can you, among the million things that like a young imagined CEO is concerned about, data protection and what might happen when they scale up or on down the road is probably one of the lower ones. And I don't also want the third employee at every startup to be a lawyer. despite being a lawyer, would be cool. But so, what are the arguments that you can sell to these innovators to get them to pay attention to our privacy, our free expression rights, and at what stage should you is the best stage to step in to make that sale? And I guess Brad would be.
I mean,
a great
Brad, you
target.
provide that expertise in effect.
Well, we are also are constantly going to school, in what our entrepreneurs are doing. Thanks for the shout out about that. We're investors, and it's an example of how you can use the lack of data as a business way. I believe that one of the key differentiators going forward as we live our lives more and more online and involved in these networks is going to be actually the values that are expressed in the way the networks are designed. You can't just say it, you have to design the networks. DuckDuckGo has designed a network where they cannot track you, and so the values are expressed in that network. And I think that'll be a selling point and a differentiator. The question of business models, our firm, we're investors in Twitter and Tumblr and Foursquare and a whole bunch of what people think of as network businesses. And those businesses are defensible through something called a network effect. And the network effect, if you step back, is really just they control the data. So, if they have, if people think of a network effect as if you have two people, you have a third person, the network's more valuable, a fourth person, the network's more valuable. It's really the data that's revealed by those people that is creating the value and creating the lock-in. And so I think we have a situation where we again have to begin to challenge ourselves whose data this is, because just because an individual interacts with a service provider doesn't necessarily, right now, possession is 9/10 of the law, and the service provider has the data, so the assumption is that it's the service provider's data. But if we step back and rethink that, we have an opportunity to construct entirely new markets that would be based on a different way of looking at that data. And I don't think markets go away, and I don't think the businesses go away if you construct those differently. And I also want to make sure that I'm not coming off as somebody who believes that service providers should have no access. I actually believe service providers should have equal access. But data is an interesting thing. It's a non-rival good. I can have it and you can have it at the same time. But right now, if I'm the service provider, I have it, and the user who created the data by interacting with the service provider has nothing, right? And so if we begin to think about opening that up, the really interesting thing that happens is that it begins to undo network effects. Because if the individuals have direct access, think about it as the equivalent access to the data, then they can begin to federate their identity across multiple service providers by making their data available to different service providers. And by doing so, they can begin to break away from services that are actually controlling their interactions through a network effect. And that will create a different market, and there will be investors in that market, and there will be business returns in that market.
Sharon, would you care to comment on this?
Very similar views. So you don't want to, on one hand, the network effect is what makes these companies very valuable, and there is a threat of while it might create more opportunity, right, it might diminish the value of some of these companies unless they innovate.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question.
If it's all right, I have just two quick questions to
Could you
two
introduce
panelists.
yourself?
Yes, sure. Usman Ahmed with eBay, PayPal, and I teach at Georgetown. First, for Mr. Burnham, completely agree with your notion that disruptive players are collecting different types of data that could be provided to regulators to demonstrate that they're actually achieving the goals of regulators better than the companies that they're disrupting, and it's something we've worked a lot on the PayPal side of our business, where we're regulated as a bank, even though we're not a bank, and we are trying to tell regulators it's actually we can give you the data that you want and demonstrate that we're providing a better service, but we're not a bank. So there are two problems with it. One, the regs aren't written in a way that actually require the types of data that we're collecting, so you have to change the regulator mindset. And two, it only really works if every player in the ecosystem is willing to provide that stuff, and that's another problem. So you've got problems on both sides, so do you have any solutions for that? And then quickly to Mr. Lemos, you mentioned the word infrastructure and internet players, and just really quickly at a high level, I don't disagree with that, but infrastructure in the regulatory sense tends to mean more regulation, and we should regulate infrastructure because it's so important. So how do you deal with that?
So I'll start. So I have one idea about how to encourage more people in an ecosystem to share data with regulators, and that is to use a carrot and not a stick. And the carrot the interesting carrot would be to provide some kind of safe harbor. If you're sharing data with us, then we are not going to use that data